Hello class, welcome to our second session for readings in Philippine history. So our lesson for today distinguishes primary from secondary sources. We'll also be discussing the relationship of historical subject matter being studied and the historical methodology employed by the historian. Ultimately, we will tackle the task of the arbiter of facts and piece of evidence in making his interpretation and forming historical narrative. Hopefully, we'll be able to differentiate primary and secondary sources. We'll also be able to develop critical and analytical skills with exposure to primary sources, and later on evaluate historical sources for their credibility, authenticity, and provenance. Historical sources are historians' most important research tools. In general, Kirk 2018 states that historical sources can be classified between primary and secondary sources. Take note, class, that the classification of sources between these two categories depends on the historical subject being studied. So if you will be asked kung paano naka-classify ang mga sources of history natin, it will depend on the historical subject being studied. Okay, so that is the basis for classification. Let's talk about primary sources. What are primary sources? Healy Library 2020 states that primary sources are immediate, first-hand accounts of a topic from people who had a direct connection. These are sources produced at the same time as the event, period, or subject being studied. Okay, very clear here. First-hand, take note of the word first-hand. Galing sa mga taong talagang nakaranas ng particular event, period, or subject in history. I will give you an example. So if we have historians who wish to study the Commonwealth Constitution Convention of 1935, okay, are you aware that our first published written constitution was in the Commonwealth period in 1935, our 1935 Constitution. So kung gustong pag-aralan ng mga historians, ang 1935 Constitution Convention, when we say Constitution Convention, ito yung assembly, okay, a gathering of different persons under the Constitutional Commission na nagsulat at bumuo ng ating 1935 Constitution. So if you would like to study that event in history, what primary sources should we take into account? Primary sources, primary sources. So we have minutes of the convention. So for example, minutes of the meeting, okay? Minutes of the convention, what took place in the convention during that time. Yung mga pag-uusap, yung mga talakayan, okay? Nakalagay yan doon sa minutes of convention. Newspaper clippings. You have newspaper clippings at that time. Philippine Commission reports of the U.S. commissioners, the records of the convention, the draft of the Constitution itself, even photographs of the event are considered as primary sources. Also, eyewitness accounts of convention delegates and their memoirs, their diaries, their journals. So, With all these primary sources, a historian would be able to study the flow of events during the Philippine Commonwealth Constitution Convention of 1935. We have other primary sources in studying history. So we have archival documents, mga archives natin, artifacts, memorabilia, letters, census, and also government records of that time. Okay, so yan ang primary sources. Let's now go to the other kind. Siyempre, kung may primary, we have secondary sources as well. Harvard Library, on the other hand, explains that secondary sources were created by someone who did not experience firsthand or who did not participate in the events or conditions. So technically, these secondary sources are sources that were produced by an author who just used primary sources to produce the material. In other words, secondary sources are historical sources which studied a certain historical subject. So, meron ng primary source na nauna, yun yung ginamit ng isang historian to produce a particular material. For example, a textbook. Okay? In writing a textbook, a historian would write a research or would conduct studies, and at the process, he or she would be looking at primary sources. Yung na-produce niyang textbook, it will already be considered as a secondary source. So, this is an example of what I am giving you as a picture. So, for example, we have the Philippine Revolution that took place in the 19th century. Okay? The Philippine Revolution happened in the last years of the 19th century to be exact. Pero meron naman tayong textbook na sinulat ni Teodoro Agoncillo on the subject of the Philippine Revolution of 1896. Students can read Teodoro Agoncillo's Revolt of the Masses, The Story of Bonifacio, and The Katipunan, published originally in 1956. So, since the Philippine Revolution already took place in the 19th century, while Agoncillo published his work only in 1956, this makes this book, The Revolt of the Masses, a secondary source. Okay, this is the secondary source of this particular event, the Philippine Revolution. So, in writing his book, Agoncillo used primary sources. Okay? So, since this is a secondary source na produkto ng primary sources na ginamit ni author na si Agoncillo, we have the following primary sources used by Agoncillo in writing the textbook: documents of the Katipunan, interview with the veterans of the revolution, also correspondence or letter exchanges between and among Katipuneros. And so I hope that's clear as to how secondary sources come about. Okay, ginagamit ang primary source syempre para makaproduce ng secondary source. So if you would be asked, which between primary and secondary sources are more useful in writing and learning history? Meron bang mas nakakaangat between the two? Well, the answer is both. Both primary and secondary sources are useful in writing and learning history. This is according to Otis College of Arts and Design 2020. So it doesn't really mean, or it doesn't necessarily follow that since ang primary sources ay yung mga sources from people who had direct connection and direct experiences with a particular event, mas bibigyan nyo ng importance in terms of studying history and also in writing or learning history. Actually, we give equal recognition and importance to both primary and secondary sources. Since technically din naman ang secondary sources are based on primary sources, they are still regarded as essential and useful materials in writing and learning history. Okay. However, historians and students of history in the study of history need to scrutinize events well. What will we do as students of history? What would be the procedure in making sure that what we are reading or encountering is credible, valid, and truthful? How will we make sure that we are not deceived and that we will be able to ensure historical truth? That is the subject of our next topic, external and internal criticism.